Pascal, and welcome to My Kind of Country, an integral stage podcast devoted to complex and personal perspectives on politics, patriotism, and nationhood. We'll be talking with folks from the world of developmental, transformational, and regenerative cultural movements about their history of feeling about and engaging with politics, about their relationship to the imaginal soul of their nation, and how they relate to its current social circumstances and what they would most love to see in its future. This is episode 0 because we made it before the series existed. Howdy, folks, and by folks, I mean anyone who's participating in the overlapping developmental, transformational, and regenerative networks. This is the Integral Stage Canadian Politics Edition. We've spoken with integral fearologist R. Michael Fisher before about his book on Marianne Williamson and his general take on the current state of American elections, but since he and I are both Canadians, we thought it might be interesting to explore together our complex impressions of the Canadian political climate. And I was inspired by Michael's video entitled How I Came to Understand Politics to start mentally reviewing my own political journey. So I'm going to start with a sort of personal confession, a brief history of my engagements with Canadian politics and the complicated array of emotions, conclusions, and hunches that I'm sitting with now. And then Michael can respond, analyze, or tell some of his story. Um, let's see, where to begin. My first remembered engagement with Canadian politics, I think, would be my family won Best Float at the Salmon Day Parade in the town of Sointula on Malcolm Island, and we did that with a Canada-themed float. And little Layman Pascal was up on this mobile patriotism machine, looking down at a cheering crowd, Maple Leaf t-shirt, tossing out Maple Leaf flags, and my imaginal impression was of thick waves of the golden presence of the nation spirit. Kind of a specific intersubjective type of peak experience that reflected something about the civic and the patriotic. And it moved me a lot. Probably around the same time, I started to become aware of things like strikes and protests in the local fisheries industry, which was affecting everyone there. From an integral point of view, I would say that the place I came from was almost 50-50 green and amber. It was back to the land hippies and conservative farmers and fishermen trying to get along. And I felt extremely patriotic as a kid. But we moved to the Bahamas for a while in elementary school. And when we came back, my sensibility had definitely shifted both from my just natural aging, but also from the international travel experience. When I came back, I no longer really felt like the kids in my class were my peers, and their notions of status and entertainment were very local, and mine was now kind of global. And I entered this period of living a real question about my political identity. How much was I Earth human, and how much was I Canadian, or in what way do I put those two together? My social ideals at that time were probably, I guess I called them monarchy at the time, which was a combination of like a childish sympathy for aristocratic, imperialistic nationalism on the one hand, but enormous individual liberty and freedom on the other. I started to listen to a lot of CBC radio political comedy, of which there was several shows, and I learned to do voice impressions of then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Premier Vander Zalm in BC and other characters like Ed Broadbent and John Turner. And I think the comedy element helped me deconstruct and further humanize my view of our so-called political leaders. I was really enamored by the Rhino Party, which was a phenomenon at the time, a satirical Canadian political party that sort of thrived before there were new federal rules that made it very difficult for smaller parties to effectively run at the national level. I think I had a sense that I had just missed Pierre Trudeau, and that everybody who was older than me seemed to regard him as a pretty interesting character of some kind, dynamic and aggressive and intellectual and even countercultural in certain ways. And it seemed to be a guy who, rightly or wrongly, was trying to build a strong, unified, bilingual national identity of some kind. I didn't think a lot about politics, but I ended up on the student council in my high school and got to make a lot of close observations about groupthink and propaganda and assumptions about voting alliances and public communication. Around that time, I remember being I guess kind of horrified by Prime Minister Jean Chrétien's callous jokes about pepper spraying G7 protesters. Then I remember being kind of profoundly depressed at the reign of Stephen Harper, who seemed to me uninspired and uninspiring and presiding over the quiet death of Canadian identity. There was a moment where my friend and I went to a free pancake breakfast at the BC Liberal campaign headquarters. It was the day of the election, and I was so bored there that they had this bucket of pins, and I started just putting dozens and dozens of political pins all over my body, and this really enamored some of the people on the team, and they took me in a limo to the airport to meet Premier-elect Gordon Campbell, and I ran out on the tarmac and gave him a hug, but it was all a joke to me, and then I just left. But the ease with which they fell for such a simple thing really stayed in my mind.
It just reminds me of you being so postmodern performative at a very quite early age. Good for you.
Yeah, yeah, I was definitely experimenting with that kind of stuff, and it did the stunt element really started to stand out to me. And around then, maybe a little
Uh,
bit after then, the National Liberals brought in Michael Ignatieff, and I was curious. I go like, oh, this is a serious Canadian political thinker about the nature of Canada, but he was so dull. I remember watching him give a policy talk in the Yukon at a town hall meeting, and I just started wishing he would take his shirt off and do some push-ups. That really clarified for me that I and maybe everyone else have been over focused on the verbal dimension, right? And not looking at stunts get you free publicity, but they also communicate to a subliminal aspect of the collective psyche. And so I started watching political debates with the sound off from then on, just to watch how they move, because the easiest thing to deceive with is words. And yet that's the part we all respond to generally. So I took that into account. I started to volunteer with the Green Party for a while because I'd seen one brochure I really loved. They had a brochure, and every page was for a different party, right? If you're voting conservative, here's why you should vote Green. If you're voting liberal, here's why you should vote Green. And there was a page for if you're a non voter, here's why you should vote Green. And I love that because I have a lot of respect for non-voters. And so and it had a kind of like integrative sensibility to this layout. So I got involved with them, but was disappointed and no real change occurred. Um, I think I was voting tactically at that time. I was trying to encourage the least bad outcome. And then several times in a row, in terms of local ridings, the candidate I really wanted lost by just a few votes. And I felt like, oh, I could have maybe turned the tide here, or people like me could have turned the tide if they just went all in on who they actually liked. So I started to move toward a feeling of spirit voting or something like that. And around the
mm,
same time, I was beginning to run forums and create spaces and intellectual tools around the theory of integral politics and doing deep study on my own about the mechanisms of collective intelligence. So, voting reform and like the actual mechanisms of how groups make decisions started to stand out to me as way more important than who you choose. I campaigned twice for single transferable vote, which had been chosen by BC referendums as the best political system for the province, but it passed in the major cities and made no impression on the small rural ridings. And there were a lot of I was working with a lot of progressive, retired, older Victoria ladies who liked to talk about voting reform in trendy downtown coffee shops, but they were not going to Bella Coola to inform anyone there. I did vote once for the NDP, which was for Jack Layton because he seemed so dandy and energetic. And I'd seen this poster. It was like the Obama Hope poster, and it just said mustache and had Jack Layton's face. And I thought, yes, you had me at mustache. I can get in on this aesthetic. I was in a voting reform organization which extracted a pledge from then candidate Justin Trudeau to do a referendum on proportional representation voting once he got into office. And he immediately turned his back on that pledge when he got into office. And then the whole trucker convoy thing during COVID was sort of maybe the final nail in the coffin of my national pride. I saw people in this town. I'd moved out to Ontario by then, and I saw people cheering and waving flags, and there was this whole thing about this is the largest peaceful protest movement in the history of my nation. And uh, the prime minister ignored and demonized them. The CBC treated them as a dismissive joke. None of the federal political leaders even seemed to attempt to talk to them or absorb any of the cultural energy they represented. It was like none of the politicians even wanted to do politics anymore. Um, so then I felt mostly, and have for a while, very local in my civic engagement, city oriented like Socrates and Kierkegaard, or bioregionally oriented. Generally, I would say, as a Canadian voting citizen now, my sense is that multinational influences are so strong that nations often can't solve the problems by themselves and would need coordination. I think background planetary and technological changes are coming so fast that if policy proposals don't sound radical, they're probably not even viable. I think there's a radical neoliberal duopoly with two heads, and one pretends to have green postmodern social values and is very exclusionary and demeaning to the old fashioned and the rural, and then the other half of the same monster pretends to have revolutionary conservative values. They instinctively cooperate, so it's hard to get any enthusiasm, even though in many practical affairs and ethical affairs, one half of that equation is significantly better than the other. But I would like to see us get beyond majoritarian representational voting. I would like to see secret ballot in the legislature. I would like to see free secondary education and better universal health care. I would like to see better integration with the military and maybe a year of military or medical training for people after high school. I would like to see our politics migrate away from just, I have the sense that it runs interference between groups, and the groups could be the Sony Corporation or the oil lobby or the indigenous nations or the environmentalists or whatever it is, but they seem to prioritize group pressure over individual well-being, and that's something I would like to see us figure out a way to grow beyond without sacrificing any of the important realities that groups stand for. I would like to see us build. I mean, we have a railway, we have a highway. We used to make big things in this country. And during COVID, when the Chinese were building a hospital a week, we didn't build a single new hospital. We just tried to not use our limited resources rather than actively try to generate more resources. So all of that sort of in the cloud, the ethos with which I approach Canadian politics at the moment. But the main thing for me comes back to this civic spirit thing. I think we need new ways to unfold the primary value feelings of people into experimental new forms of cultivating a civic shared cultural ethos that's a sacred thing, and that we have to actively prioritize that in order to generate it. And I think although I'm not homosexual, I have gay pride. I'm not ethnically Native American, but I have indigenous pride. When I see pyramids or rockets or read the works of ancient sages, I have deep human pride. And I would love to have Canadian pride again. And I'm super curious about what it would take to get that in a multipolar age of meta crisis and new information landscapes. So that's a lot. Let's say fire hose of where I'm at in my life on Canadian politics. How about you, Michael?
Well, thank you. Thank you. I mean, that was a pretty damn good stump speech. And I say that seriously. And I'm a little in awe, quite frankly, that listening to that, it's entrancing. So that's my experience just right off the top as we were just communicating here. And I'm tuning into, I had no idea you had that political history and histories that are pretty dynamic and very visceral. So that's my first couple of responses. That was visceral. This is not a talking head. And I could feel it. I could watch it. I could sense it in the way you spoke and the performance of the way you spoke it and you organized things. And you just had this very gentle spirit at the same, sense of a passion that feels like it's in a box. I can feel a kind of suffering actually. There's a felt sense I get, a suffering of uh, and it hurts. It actually hurts. And so then I thought, wow, has Layman ever given a 5 minute monologue on his political interests ever. Have you ever had a chance to actually unfold that monologue uninterrupted?
Yeah, not really, other than maybe, with friends or in domestic circumstances. I haven't recorded stuff like that because
Okay.
you stray into different territories. But this is, and one of the reasons I wanted to go through that is it's a kind of fresh thing for me to present that, and I appreciate
Yeah.
how you see that because it is visceral, and it is painful. Right, my
Yeah.
heart's involved in this.
Yeah. And remember in our second talk at one point you said it hurts my heart. There's one place in our second talk. And so, that registered and I still remember it well. So yeah, just really appreciating that sincerity that you have, even though, it would be so easy for the cynic to get very intellectual, and you're very capable to be intellectual and you have wonderful vocabulary. But at the same time, I think you have a really nice combination, really integrated well, an embodied sensibility when you're speaking in vulnerability. So it's admirable. I'm going, oh my gosh, this is such a good political candidate right in front of me here and in front of us, because you really have a really well eloquence is nice, etc. But all of those qualities. So you just to me, made me think of how I can support leaders. So I come into politics not wanting to be a political leader, although I have thought of running at different times. But I'm so not in the groove of politics and political life. And when I hear your life story just now, I go, whoa, okay, that's a Canadian that's really in the groove of a political life. And yes, I can see somebody like I know a little bit about Jordan Peterson, his background coming out of Canada, Alberta. He was similar as a young teenager, completely in the parties. He was completely dedicated to this political life and then becomes, quite the intellectual and now is this huge public intellectual, making in his own world of politics and political connections. And I see you as somewhat very similar, actually. I think you have the groove, but for various reasons, you haven't gone his route. But that was just I got a bit of a reflection of a Jordan Peterson right in front of me, actually. Again, obviously, you not coming out of northern Alberta and the rural, but you came out of a rural and you have a real rural sensibility, and I can sort of feel that too. So that's another piece of feedback. And I guess maybe what something in there is speaking to me is that, you know, there's always been this huge divide. You say, I really want a civic spirit reignited. So I'm just paraphrasing. And then we've got this huge divide between Canada being so rural, urban, and not just rural, we have wilderness. So I was thinking this morning, just imagining if you live in the United States, pretty much anywhere, it's United States, lots of people, up, below, east, and west. In Canada, it's lots of people, east, west, south, but not north. It's like once you get above a certain parallel of where the major cities are, and it's not that far up in Canada, barely a third, maybe a quarter even, 3/4 of the nation is this wide open, literally sort of difficult, if not impossible, to conquer geographic space. So I start thinking of Canadians have a uniqueness there, and that's the place based. That's a place based, land based, environmental based, third party almost. It's like we're not just in the city and the rural. It's not just urban rural divide. It really is something else with this third element. You won't get that in the United States. And that's where our main influence of political thinking and imaginaries come from, as well as a lot of ideologies. But again, even in Europe, for the most part, out of our ancestry, yeah, it's a very civilized, so-called, very dense populations. it's hard to feel that land-based respect. So when you say civic spirit, I come to the word respect. And you said, I have, what did you use? An honoring for, the indigenous. I'm not sure that's the exact word you use. What word did you use? And you even said for the history of, the Egyptians and others that create spaceships. You had an
Um,
honoring of the ancestors, but it
y-
was a
y-
different word than honoring.
yeah, well, pride, I think,
Pride.
was what I
Thank you.
use. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And so I'm remembering from our second talk, we got into having excitement in the political sphere and how easily it's poo-pooed. And then having the word pride is interesting how it's popping up, right? And then this respect, pride. So you can see we're very much in this affective realm of the political life. And it seems really that would be to me where we have to re-educate ourselves from this kind of rationalist Western Enlightenment thinking about the political sphere. And that's the communal sphere,
Mhm.
right? The political sphere and the communal sphere has gotten so conflated, and it's hard to pull apart the communal sphere, and the cultural sphere from the political. And then to think how to come to it and reignite it through the affective. And so that's just a theme I'm watching in our conversation here today, which doesn't ignore, important meta thinking and critical thinking and so on. So those are a few thoughts.
Yeah, that sense that the government is far away that Americans have, I think is even greater in Canada in a sense. Like when I was a kid, there was this sense that anything east of the Rocky Mountains was just some bizarre old-fashioned throwback wasteland, like as far as PC was concerned. But there's the sense that it's so much space. And I think you're absolutely right that the spaciousness of the wilderness is an additional factor here in a way that it probably isn't anywhere else except possibly Russia or something
Yeah.
like that, right?
Yeah.
And I'd be very intrigued to see where the drift is. There's been an empowerment of indigenous government in
Yeah.
the Nunavut territory now in a really unique way that's just begun. And whether they instantiate that place in wilderness in different ways will be really interesting to watch, I think. One of the things I'm most excited about is the possibility of different styles of governance and land management, right? If we can have basic parameters and points to meet that are generally shared, we should have something where different communities can run things differently in different areas if we can all inspect that and learn from those experiments. Because we have no guarantee that the way we're generally running it is the best way. So when I look at like indigenous land rights, I'm often looking at this as a prototype for a diversification of governance
Yeah.
that could be experimentally done. But coming back to the affect thing, absolutely. I think, I feel like the symbols and the aesthetics build the vibe, and the vibe exists for a long time before it becomes capable of discerning between policies and candidates, right? Like, Christianity was around for centuries before it chose the crucifixion as an image, right? There was a buildup of this affective and aesthetic experience. And I think there's things you can do there, you know, uh, a beaten up pickup truck in the Northwest Territories with solar panels in the back kind of tells you everything you need to know in a single image. You can unite those different zones aesthetically and affectively in a very obvious way that starts to create a flavor that people can tune into so that down the line that can become a political mobilization.
I want to ask you a question about, you shared your narrative, at least an initial, coordinated narrative of your political attention to Canadian politics. I'd like you to just rethink that narrative a little bit and do a bit of a fear analysis of it yourself. So you can picture yourself in that from that perspective and or the people and the community around you. How do you think a fear um, vector is playing in that narrative that you just expelled?
That's a really intriguing question. I mean, the first emotional response I have is something like, that the domain of politics itself is untrustworthy because you'd have to live in fear in terms of how much of yourself you share, right? That there'd be a constant policing as a response to a fear vibration that would make me hesitate, and I think would make a lot of people hesitate about being in that world.
Mhm.
Fear of boredom, fear of public attack, fear of losing any momentum you've created by exposing too many aspects of yourself. I think there's also a sense that, if I were to think of myself as a candidate in that sense, and like you said, compared to a Peterson type candidate, right? Peterson is capable of integrative thinking when he's at his best, but his popularity thrives on dividing the population, a similar way to Trump's dividing of the population. And I have a fear that that sort of fear-based dividing is inherently more successful than attempts to integrate and unify. So I see fear as the tactic, but I also fear the success of fear as a tactic.
Nice. Yeah, nicely put. You kind of brought that up, I think, when we were just talking about Marianne Williamson versus Trump in American politics, is who wins? You know, love-based approach, Marianne Williamson. No. Fear-based. Yep. So yeah, so I guess the collusion, right? The collusion, or we could maybe just summarize it. It's a fear of power. I mean, I think that our relationship with power has to be analyzed really and deconstructed with, and you can see, I want to add the word fear with power rather than power will get you what? It's like, well, let's pull back and go, what got us to after this thirst for power? See, I go, what is there already in the thirst for power, not just what power can cause? So we're now getting to the source. And so that's where I use the idea of meta motivations is a term that I like to use, that there are seemingly two large meta motivations that seem to be pretty strong throughout humanity. That's what my research shows across traditions, secular and sacred, across time. And those are basically love and fear. Some people say love and hate, but love and fear is actually, I think, much more correct. And you see it, all over the spiritual literatures, more or less. So there's a negotiation going on about, are we going to be fear driven? And it's motivating. It's a meta motivational platform. It's like, whoa, that will motivate a lot of other things. And it motivates other emotions. It's like it's that's why I see it as a driver, a huge driver. And I'm not the only one. Like I say, the wisdom traditions have this. And then there's the love-based motivation. And so you could say one is more about the division, the fear-based approach, deficit thinking, how can I get advantage, competitive, and then you got the love, unity, cooperation, peace. How did you come out in the peace movement? You must have interacted with that through your various connections in politics, or especially Green Party. But was it in there all the time, that in the sense you're working to be in the groove of the political life, but you must have been thinking. So was there an anti-war part of you? Were you influenced by discourses like that? How is peace related to your efforts,
Yeah, to some degree.
even till today?
I remember being in Beacon Hill Park in Victoria. It was many years ago, and I think the Sri Chinmoy Center would do an annual peace march. And I was watching these people. I mean, I guess I was in the march. I was following along, but mostly I was analyzing the other protesters. And I thought, wow, this peace march goes on every year, and I don't think war is decreasing. So this clearly doesn't work. I'm like,
Gotcha.
what's a better solution, right? The opposition between war and peace stood out to me as a limitation. And I started to feel like I don't hear anyone saying, how do we have better wars? All right. How do we have smaller, more efficient, more effective wars that produce more thriving and more peace as an outcome? What's more intelligent militarism? Because I do have a childhood streak of interest in the military, and I also feel like one of the things that holds back the nation spirit is the lack of integration between the military and the general population. So when I lived in Victoria, I was shocked to hear the number one industry in Victoria is the Navy. And if you live downtown, you never see anyone from the Navy ever. You just think, oh, tourism is what we run on. But tourism is second to the military, and all the people involved live in a sequestered form. And when we have civic holidays like Veterans Day, we celebrate older people, retired people, right? Former cops and former soldiers. We don't have a day where we celebrate the actual military or where there's an attempt to exchange information and understanding and sentiment between the part of the population that's engaged in the military and the part that isn't. And I think that's necessary for us to start thinking, how are we smarter, more peace oriented soldiers? And there used to be, it seemed to me when I was a kid, that Canadians had a military identity as peacekeepers, and that's sort of evaporated, around the turn of the millennium to some degree. And it would be nice to bring that back, that we are
Mm,
trained
mm,
and capable and understand that defense and aggression is part of the nation spirit, but that we specifically
mm.
specialize in doing that in a way that promotes peaceful outcomes.
Yeah, so you just to me have given a pretty good, piece of the civic pride, um, to even the point of military pride. I mean, you're literally sort of saying it implicitly. And of course, that is like such a trigger for green meme. It's like, oh my gosh, or and yet, I think it leads to what you're saying is I want an intelligent military ethos in a country, as well as the intellectuals, the research, the international research, the history of military. Why are we not accumulating the best wisdom? This is
Yeah.
ridiculous. We actually have that data. We have the capabilities. And then, the idea that Canadian military, but also Canadian citizen could actually be the nation of peacekeepers,
Yeah.
but informed by this advanced thinking about the military. We're not scared to use the military, and we're not going to just put it in. This is my ideal as I'm listening to you. We're not just going to put the military into romantic imaginary.
Yeah.
And it's either romantic for or romantic against. We
Exactly.
really are just like stuck in romanticizing that there's could be a world without war, a country, and or the military are great and they're, that's why you're here and that's why you're free. We fought for it. This is to me is the romantic imaginary is really killing. It's very dead intellectually. And of
Yeah.
course,
And
there
so
is a kind of intellectualism.
there's an advanced intellectual thing where you come at all problems and go, well, clearly it's not one of the opposites. I have to build a
Yeah,
hybrid solution. But there's a very on the ground approach too, which is if you talk to friends and they're in the military, you end up with a different sensibility, a mixed sensibility. But
yeah.
most people who aren't in the military don't have any friends they talk to who are in the military. So there's a communication circuit that's broken. And as you pointed out, the it's sort of implied aspect of military pride that might be triggering to Green in what I was saying. I thought of all the ways in which I also support a kind of pride that would be deemed way too green in many respects. Like I used to watch parades in cities, and I would go, yeah, all these parades just represent sort of middle class business owners. So that those people can show those businesses to their kids on the side of the road. And I always thought, well, where's the float for our drug addicts? Where's the float for our schizophrenics? Where there's other segments of the population here, and we can embrace them as part of us, even if we have problems and concerns about how they're living and what's going on. So I would
Yeah.
like to diversify and strengthen the forms of pride that are available to the nation.
Yeah, there's a nice diversify the forms of pride. Yeah, there's a title for a book, Diversifying the Forms of Pride. And then all of it, is coming to me is in Canadian, I'll stay with Canadian, is I don't know. Do you know, do we have a good futurist Canadian that we know of that has
Not,
influenced and is influencing? I do not know one.
I can't think of one. I mean, the closest thing was probably David Suzuki.
Yeah,
right? And
sort of.
his time has passed, and he was very ecologically oriented.
He
But
was. He was.
but when you look at ecology and you look at science, there's a future orientation, right? There's a I mean,
Yeah.
Peterson is smart and Peterson is interesting, and I love the suits and I like provocative positions, but
Mm-hmm.
he is very retroactive in his thinking. It's very much how do we rehabilitate ancient archetypal views and how do we revalorize conservative principles and things like
Yeah,
that,
yeah, for sure.
right?
Yeah, he's
There's,
conserving, and I'm
yeah.
not, that's the conservative part of my politics. So I'll just admit, um, and I think it is the integralist way in the most general sense is it's to integrate the best of the conservative movement and the liberal movement, and I think Ken Wilber's book on Up from Eden, if you remember it, it's got the last chapter is his book on politics, so he's barking out the evolution of human culture,
Yeah.
this huge overrun, and macro scale. And then he ends with the chapter on politics, and he says there's basically three parties, two parties, but there's a third alternative, and one was the Democrat, one was the Republican, and one was the mystic. That's the title of his third chapter, his last chapter in that book. And that was my first hit.
Mm.
So my first intellectual hit of politics was that chapter in Ken Wilber, book 1981, Up from Eden. I didn't understand it really, and I couldn't take it in, and it was very difficult to me to digest. And it'd be good to reread it at some point. However, I also was aware in that book, Up from Eden, the underlying metaphysical treatment that he had given to evolution of consciousness. And then he's trying to sort of say, well, could that be useful for a political world, right? And this is integral politics, I think, one of his
Yeah.
earliest pieces on integral politics. And he was really saying is that there's this kind of Atman project that gets twisted into a negative Atman project, which I was thinking at some place later I said, well, that's a fear project. It's a fear projection of the other, right? It's the moment that the differentiation from the unity starts to have differentiation and difference. It's easy to project back both ways that there's some threat to differentiation itself within evolution of consciousness. And then Surdy says this project was actually controlling the entire evolution of our species of consciousness. And that became very interesting to me as a metaphysical theory of fear. And so I actually draw on Ken Wilber and his notion of the Atman project. What he called before that was dualism, repression, projection. That was in his very first book, age 23, and he's pulling out this DRP, saying there's a process of this dualism, repression, projection, fear projection, and it's killing us. It's like if we do not deal with that, that will just destroy all things evolving, higher and lower levels, competing and trying to wipe out each other. So I'm talking really metaphysically there. But in the end, that's why I come back to a fearological perspective. Is I've just said that is a deep meta-motivational template driving those projects. We called it the immortality projects in our second video, etc. Without going into all that detail technically, but this, when you talk about a civic spirit, I'm going, well, where are you going to get that spirit? Because spirit is not pure. If I took my notion and a kind of Wilberian notion of spirit, it's very contested in this problem of the dualism, repression, projection dynamic that seems to be pretty natural. And you have to be able to integrate those divisions. And that's the movement toward, what we call non-dual, right? To a consciousness. But that doesn't happen. You just don't go to the non-dual. It's like all the structures and in between places and things that have to grow and develop, they're contested. And upper levels want to kill some part of the lower levels. The lower levels want to kill some part of the higher levels. So that integral theory, if we could only, and this is what I did not see in integral theory when I was in that community for a while, and I had to get out of it. It was just driving me nuts. I divorced it and it divorced me, no doubt. And it's because I said Ken Wilber's work and this basic integral theory, as I understand it, especially from that book Up from Eden, which he admits is his dark story. It's his dark story of the evolution of consciousness. And he's basically saying it's a conflict-based world. That is a conflict theory. Like Ken Wilber is just the next conflict theorist, the critical theorist, and they're really conflict theorists. That's what he was saying is at the base. It's in the baked into the entire evolution. So I kept trying to bring this conflict theory into integral, and it's like, no way. There's no way there was a palatability for it. And it's almost because it's too political, right? There is a politicality in that conflict. Right? It's about there it is. So where did the integralist community, the movement generally wanted to go? It wanted to go to bring unity, bring unity, bring unity, bring unity, transcendence, transcendence. And there's this huge upper movement. And of course, that led to all kinds of critiques on integral. And then I found the business community people, the organizational management consultants, and people that wanted to set up businesses based on integral theory or bring it into their consulting, which seems like, oh, it's going to embrace difference. And that's a great idea. It's got diversity, spiral dynamics. And yet it's like you just couldn't hear the conflict. It wasn't in the discourse. What was in the discourse was bringing together and understanding and collecting and the dialogue and that's sort of why the peace movement also fell apart for me. I just felt it wanted to learn all about how to bring unity, and it still wasn't doing a really good analysis of the conflict. So my master's degree at UBC in 1998 was on conflict. And then my PhD was on fear. So you can hear where I'm going. That
Yeah,
is
yeah.
my political intellectual project. If we do not get in between, the problem of domination is the problem. And when you have domination, you're going to have conflict. And when you have conflict that's not resolved well, you're going to have more and more fear. Fear is going to take over. And when you have fear take over, you're going to have violence. So domination, conflict, fear, violence. So domination and violence on the outside, those are the external manifestations. They're easier to see, right? They're the symptomatics. But what's the work that's going on in between is conflict and fear, conflict and fear. So that's what I did my entire grad studies on. And I couldn't get a job and nobody cared and nobody wanted to really read that stuff. And they still don't, for the most part. Not in education, that's for sure. A few
The
sociologists are sort of interested.
the impression I get in hearing that, and I
Yeah.
think you're absolutely right. Uh, there's neutered versions of higher stages emerge where they haven't actually worked with the conflicts that they're trying to integrate. They want to just jump to
Mm,
integrated states on
right.
stages. But it seems like every um, if I look at a whole developmental spectrum, down the spectrum, people are more obvious about conflict, and in some ways they integrate it better. And further up the spectrum, they understand the possibility of transcending conflict so clearly they want to have already transcended it, right? And you see this between orange and amber, where orange politicians are like, it almost seems like these Amber politicians don't even mean what they say. And the Amber politicians like, of course we don't. This is a team sports event. We're calling you out and our job is to defeat you. Right. And then it's the same thing at Green. It's very hard for anybody to acknowledge they have any aggression at all, except in their weird reactions to people they think are aggressive. So there's something like there's a way that we have to do better at incorporating the intensities and the visceralities of conflict that are apparent lower down the scale and keep those in play while also integrating and smoothing them out at the higher levels so that you have a really robust anti-fragile version of these higher stages so that in some ways they can actually compete in the civilization rather than just sort of float around in small pools of intellectuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was thinking that at some point I want to just read a little bit of do a little geeky thing on you if you're ready for it. I thought I would do a little bit of a fearological analysis of a little particular period in history in Canadian history. It's
Great.
an
Yeah.
intellectual history. So it's a mini, basically within a 10-year frame, roughly,
Right.
intellectual history. And why I wanted to do that is if I was to attempt to encourage leaders in the political sphere today, so let's take a young people or even older people, but let's just think about young people thinking about, I really want to do something about the world. I don't want to just sit back. Um, I would say, well, there's some things you want to probably understand about fear, conflict, etc. Really study that, and so the fear piece I'll construct here. It starts around 1983. So let me get my notes. But I want to read a quick quote first from Brian Musumi, Canadian philosopher from Montreal. In this book, I just want to read how he defines and organizes and conceptualizes fear. He says, "For the enemy is us," very common phrase. This kind of analysis, he says, however necessary that we admit that, he says it's not enough. But we have to realize is that the saturation of fear in our current society is leading to where we have to invent a new resistance. So the saturation of fear in culture, society, political world, etc., we have to actually invent a new resistance. And then he sort of says, fear under conditions of complicity, our complicity, that we're saturated in it. This is like we're saturated in that conflict. You just don't transcend that at some level. Can be neither analyzed nor opposed. So fear under conditions of complicity, as an agent of knowledge and knowing and making. That fear under these conditions of complicity can neither be analyzed nor opposed without at the same time being enacted. So there's no pure standpoint outside of the fear-based structuring that you can analyze and try to resist fear. And he says, we don't really know how to do that. That intrigued me in 1993 when he wrote that book and with others. But let me give you the quick history of, and you'll see where Masumi comes in 1993. But the actual history I want to do is in the 80s. But it's related to him. So I would say the Canadians that we want to pay attention to fearologically are the following. And I'll try to put them roughly in order. And I'm going to start with Quebec, the province of Quebec. And it's province of Quebec in the late 1970s. This is so 79, we're just moving into 1980. I just want to give this little preface. The province of Quebec invited in Jean-Luc Lyotard, French philosopher, quite communitarianist, postmodern, And they invited him to write about the future of technology. And the piece of Canadiana wanted this futurist philosopher from France to help us to understand how we're going to deal with technology. And he wrote a report. And in 1979, that report was published. And it's, basically I don't know how to say the French title, but the Canadian title is The Postmodern Condition. This is Canada, 1984. It is the only province in Canada that ever made that move as a province to actually pull in a postmodern perspective. I just want to point that out. Thank you, Eastern Canada. That's huge historically that I know of. You could correct me if there's any real good historians here. I'm not a historian. But what was the point of that book is that to me it introduced how terrifying the world is becoming. So I'll just leave it at that. The postmodern condition. Republished in 1984, and here's where I'm going to start my history of Canadiana around fear, because we're moving into 1984 and we're getting echoes of George Orwell's 1984. He wrote that in 1949, a dystopian novel. and 1984 is hitting. So here I am zooming in on this 1984, in this short period in mid-80s for fear studies, Canadiana fear studies. So let's move on to what was really important. I ended up doing my PhD at UBC, and I'm going, did I go to UBC? A lot of reasons. I went there in 1998 to 2003. But here's what happened at UBC in 1983. It is the earliest in the history of fear studies where there was a conference, interdisciplinary, dedicated to the study of fear. 1983, that conference. They published a book in 1986. It took them 3 years to put the transcripts together, published the book. And the title of that book, I found it in the UBC library, is called Sociophobics, the Anthropology of Fear. Why is that important? These writers across disciplines, there are some literary people, there's historians, but there's a lot of anthropologists, a lot of sociologists, a few social psychologists, maybe one. What wasn't in there is the psychologists and psychiatrists in the medical profession. So this, they write in the intro in Sociophobics, you can hear it, social fear, the study of the anthropology, right, with the culture of fear. They were basically starting with psychology has dominated our understanding of fear for too long, and it's been left alone, and it's time we spoke up. And so the social sciences now, right, and anthropology, etc., the cultural studies, began their first interrogation and critique of the psychology of fear, and then putting out new notions and places to study this powerful emotion. It wasn't a book on the sociology of shame or guilt or some other emotion. It was fear that they chose. So to me, as a fearologist, that's interesting. It happened at UBC. Nowhere else in the world I know of has had an international interdisciplinary conference on fear. Canada, initiated, published. Okay, so I jumped to 1985. I think one of our most important fearological thinkers we can celebrate and be proud of is Margaret Atwood. The dystopian novel, Handmaid's Tale, published in 1985. So think about, again, 1983, there's this gathering. Now fear is becoming a sociophobic phenomenon, not just this individual psychology phenomenon. And then we have the dystopian novel that, was so powerful. And of course, took years and years before that novel became a movie in the last few years. That was all interesting. And then just parallel a little footnote. In America, 1989, as we're coming to that period of going into the new decade, 1989, a very important year, right? This is the fall of the Russian Empire. This is the fall of the Berlin Wall the year after, and so on. The so-called breaking of the Cold War. But in 1989, a company formed called No Fear Incorporated. This is unheard of if you think of cultural history of fear studies. And they began this t-shirts and the hats that said "No Fear!" exclamation mark. Still actually penetrating into the economic world today. But what was it saying? That to me is the rebel impulse to the terrifying nature of the way the postmodern condition is appearing, this existential level of dread, at least. And as Masumi says, we're saturated in fear. We don't even recognize ourselves without recognizing fear. It's like they're just so back to back. And what happens is the resistance movement starts and it becomes into popular culture. Now that came out of the States, even though it was also in that 1983, 1980 conference. That is a resistance movement, right? To understand more about how fear is controlling us. Well, that's a type of resistance. We're not just gonna, be saturated without a response back. And then the next one is Charles Taylor. Do you know Charles Taylor, the philosopher out of McGill? Yeah.
Yep.
very important, and Ken Wilber cites him quite a bit. That's where I first heard of Charles Taylor, through Ken Wilber's work, talking, especially his book Sources of Self, which I've not read, which was published in 1989. So that was an opening. Charles Taylor was basically trying to get out of the positivist logical tradition of philosophy, and the attack that he had was on the philosophies that were trying to make human sciences and psychology act like they were natural sciences. He says, forget it. You can take a bit of the natural sciences, but do not use that as your paradigm for understanding humanity and social, cultural, communal. So that's he dedicated his life to that, a challenge. And so I would call him one of the Canadian moving postmodern, but he was also really traditional in many ways. So he was integrating and he didn't want to leave that. So he became very important, along with people like George Grant, who wrote an interesting book as well, another philosopher of that ilk. So Charles Taylor, we have a Canadian philosopher down east. And then I'll just jump quickly now to my project, which was in 1989. I start this In Search of Fearlessness project, not knowing any of that intellectual climate at all. I was not in grad school. And so I'm just going with my personal experience, a kind of mystical experience. I open up to this vision. There needs to be a resistance to the fear project. Now, I had been reading Wilbur since 1981, so I was aware of that project, the Atman project, the fear project, this repression project. And so I did come in and basically had a counter project. It was the resistance. It was like the No Fear Incorporated. They, of course, they commodified that. I wasn't very commodified. I was doing adult education and nonprofit service, social entrepreneur. So that In Search of Fearlessness project came in 1989 and still continues to this day. So then I think the next jump again, I would go to Brian Masumi, and that was 1993. But they actually started that in the late 1980s, the project of talking about how fear has saturated and what does that mean to our ability to actually resist fear when it's under an oppressive regime and being used as a fear-based structure. And he's saying, I don't know how we're going to resist that.
Yeah.
So there's a little
That's yeah,
Canadiana.
that's great. Well, here's some things that come up for me listening to that.
Yeah,
One is how interesting it is that it sort of takes the postmodern level of cognition to take fear seriously, right? That modernism understands there are threats, but it
yeah,
doesn't really think about the sensitivity of organisms to internal process. Sensitivity comes online as an analytic mode for the postmodernists.
that's right. Nice, nice.
Um,
The
and
affective, you can see, right? Sensitivity, the
yeah,
affective appears, that affective turn. Good. Go
there's
ahead.
something there. Like one of the things that's coming up for me a lot, and this is a bit of a digression here, but there's a problem when you look at stages as to what represents an actual stage, because we would assume sort of that traditionalist, modernist, and postmodernists make up the bulk of the value systems in the contemporary population. But then there's this other problem of to what degree are we actually seeing it when we're seeing it? To what degree have we got traditionalist conformist people espousing postmodern values, or to what degree is the modernist economic and political machine a two-headed beast that always likes to pretend that it's got a progressive and a conservative side when really it's just steering you back into the dominant economic and political mode of the world. And in that mode, there's a crisscross of fear styles, right? There's a sort of there's a fear style where some people are worried about mythic economic and military threats. There's a lot of people in this country who are worried that, our prime minister's selling us out to China. all these big Americans are going to come for our water. All this stuff is like on the horizon. And then there's another group of people who are part of the same kind of duopoly system, but their fear is different. Their fear is primarily of those people, right? Of those insane,
Yeah,
misinformed, fear based people, and
yeah,
secondarily of appearing unprofessional and foolish to their peer group in the bureaucratic and administrative aspect of the world. So those two different complementary fear sets, it's hard to tell to what degree they represent different layers of values and cognition, and to what degree they're complementary aspects of one dominant sort of hegemonic system that we're in.
Yeah.
Another thing that came up for me, just to rattle off a few more, is the role that the children of the baby boomers coming of age in the 80s and 90s and starting to get into, on the one hand, skateboarding, snowboarding,
Yep.
flow sports of various kinds, and having their own experimentation with psychedelics of various kinds, and finding ways to access states that feel fearless to them, that
Right.
gave them a kind of confidence
Yeah.
that they can ignore a lot of the incoming social fear signals because
Yeah.
they know they can find a way back to an optimal state. That seems to be really important. And then the other thing I would add in there is like fear is a good general rubric, but there's also like different ways of talking about like uncertainty and indeterminacy and exhaustion, I think are part of it. Like a lot of people are exhausted and overwhelmed by politics. We could call that a subset of fear. A lot of people, especially now, but even then, are moving into a massive distrust of the information they're receiving from legacy media. And it's sort of fear, but you could also say, well, it's just radical uncertainty in a lot of ways.
Sure. Yeah.
So, yeah, those are just a handful of responses I had
Yeah.
as you were
So
saying that stuff.
one of the things that I think we had to do, and I don't think we've done it well, of my research is that we haven't really reconstructed that conceptualization of fear from the mythic through the modern into the
Mm,
postmodern. And yeah, we're still all kinds of new consciousnesses are possible because they are possible. They have grooves from other historical times, and so people can access those. And then you have so much knowledge to access them. You can go and be with that guru on just on digital, right, and so on. You can just, but what actually isn't being reconstructed is actually a new understanding of how to understand this postmodern transition when fear has become what I call fear. It's actually a hyper real
mm,
formation. It's like a genetically modified organism. It's actually at another level of construction, reproduction, consumption. And we haven't done that analysis. I'm the only one I know of with a few of these as sort of pre-modes or preliminaries that actually tries to build that new vocabulary of a critical literacy.
mm,
If fear is such an powerful meta motivator, we better understand it
yeah.
equally as love because, and of course, we don't want to. See, that's the difference. We're a lot more easily attracted to go to a conference or a workshop on love than we are on fear. And so there's all those dilemmas of presentability. So terms that you have listed, the unknowable, I think you used in one of the last talk, not we can't quite know reality. What was your ontology of undefinable, or it's not quite there, like
The
an
metaphysics
ontology
of
of the
adjacency.
incomplete.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an ontology of the incomplete, the unknowable, right, and so on. Those are other languages for, I think, tools and access ways to methodologically, and that's why I like the postmodern so much. It actually gives a lot of credibility to those modes of knowing. All of those, the unknown, the unstable, the not quiteness of, and so on. And that's why I really like that postmodern. It really is very important in working with fear because you can just hear we don't want to do those methodologies because they're not modern and they scare the shit out of us because we don't know where we're going. And so that's that difficulty. And so that's why these replacements of something above the postmodern, whatever that those constructions are, they're so seductive because they do, even though if you really understand those traditions, they're saying the same thing. Everything's impermanence. So, but you can actually attach to that. And you can attach to those communities of discourse communities. So I want to come back to the communal sphere. Civic pride is a communal concept, would you say? I mean, it's obviously got agency to it, but it seems like it's kind of overshadowed or over determined, and that's not in a bad way, by a communal sensibility. So where are we going to get the communal sensibility when we've got so much communal mistrust? Um, the whole post-truth era, the unreliability of authority, of governments who have supported and are supposed to be the network for the communal support, security.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to imagine that given the way that things are communicated, right? Like, it's not a world in which we all tune in to watch the cliffhanger ending of Dallas at 8 p.m. on the same night. We all receive our signals at different times.
Mm,
So one problem is events are needed in order to coordinate people in moments, and I think that's key to establishing a community spirit. Then the other two parts are something like shared efforts and distresses on the one hand, and shared pleasures and enjoyments on the other.
yeah,
One of the things I used to imagine when I was a kid was uh, why isn't there a nation barbecue? Like, why couldn't you get 300 acres in Alberta? And on Canada Day, the government invites literally any Canadian who wants to come. You want a beer and a hot dog? You can come. Most people wouldn't be able to make it or wouldn't want to come, so you don't have to make it that big. But just the notion that there's an event and that the event is incorporative and applies to everybody regardless of the other categories that they're in.
yeah,
That
yeah,
seems to be important, but it does seem to be that, although there's a way to send signals in a synchronized manner, most of it's embodied. You have to get people to do things together. I think there was an enormous boom in Western civic spirit following and through the Second World War. Partly because we won and it boosted our economy, but partly because we all had to do something. We all heard and experienced the same distresses. We all made efforts, physical efforts together, because human beings anciently don't form community around discussion. We're first of all sort of embodied organisms. The discussion comes second. We have to do things
yeah.
together. There's a movie, Gran Torino, I think it is, with Clint Eastwood. Very interesting film where he's a veteran of the Korean War and his neighbors are Korean immigrants. And he uses every kind of racial slur and epithet for these people you can imagine. But when they need help, he goes over and helps them. And then they have a beer together in the backyard. And when their kid goes missing, he's the only person in the neighborhood who's there for them. And so it really shows that the bonds are formed by the shared efforts and the shared pleasures. They're not formed at the level of the symbolic exchange of language, or that's an epiphenomenon to what's going on there. So I think there have to be things that make everyone do something, and not necessarily everyone all together, but you have to mix the physical activities of people who normally naturally silo themselves. There's a rule in Singapore where you can't have more than X number of people of the same religion or ethnicity living in the same area because that makes it be less Singapore. They over concentrate that identity at the expense of the general identity, right? It doesn't have
Nice.
to be that draconian, but you do have to actively mix the people together or there won't be a shared conductive fluid, so to speak.
Bring in the urban planners to this
Yeah,
conversation. Like, I'd love
yeah.
to
The
send.
way we lay out space is enormous in terms of
Yeah,
how this
it
stuff
is
happens.
enormous. It's so enormous, and so that is something I'm very interested in too. Is the architecture of fear and fear and urban planning. There is some really good research going on. Again, most people won't see it, but you can hear it again. It's like fear. If you don't want to focus on that word all the time, like I do, I'm obsessed. But I think you can just bring in, what is the affect of architecture? What is the affect of spaces? What's the affect of organizing? So I see you as an organizer. I don't know that much about what you do every day, but I hear the organizer sensibility in you. And you plan conferences. That's what I know of. You might do more. And when I hear your political history, I go, oh yeah, yeah. You want to be part of organizations. You want to be part of organizing, but you've also come to your limits of, oh my gosh, I don't know how effective any of this is because it's hard to find the platforms for a different level of conversation,
Yeah, yeah.
but you're also saying it can't just be about conversation. So I think we're at a point where, I just heard educators in a panel and it was called Education in Difficult Times. And it was American educators, top people and deans and superintendents and a principal of a school. And they're on a panel. And one of the things that, popped out is, and you hear it a lot these days is, The children are facing an existential crisis and they can feel it and they know it. And the year 2040 for them does not mean what it meant for me when I looked ahead 15 years in my life.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking, okay, so there's a really affective, even though it's pretty cognitive and historical, existential crisis.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking that is really, I've never heard that word so much as in the last decade. And obviously around climate change being just so ominous at some level. So I'm thinking of that again when something like that becomes a kernel, what's in the discourse. It's very common. Children are starting to hear that, in even junior high and so on. So this is not foreign anymore. And that's really interesting for the postmodern condition, because that postmodern condition is quite an existentialist move. It's got that interior movement inward and then the troubling of certainty. And I'm thinking then what we've got to be able to do is really blend that language and help these young people. And of course, they're going to help us, but we have to really encourage them to actually allow that existential angst to come out. And that's why I think, like, where are we creating those spaces instead of just spaces that are about inclusivity? So we're really caught right now in the height of pluralism. This is why I brought up the communal. Pluralism is having, in my view, it's starting to become so pathological to the communal sphere itself, which is odd, right? Because it's ironic that it's actually undermining the very nature of a certain communality that has a much more to the blue meme, the amber, right? To that communality is not just about pluralism. That's a very high level concept. And it actually is, we're not prepared. The school teachers are all saying, all these leaders, we actually don't, our school systems haven't caught up to even pluralism. And then we have to deal with existential crisis that's a collective felt ethos in the people. And you're just going, our education systems are just like overwhelmed. So what we've got now is teachers dropping out. They cannot get enough teachers. Nobody wants to go hardly into that profession anymore. It's happened in the medical crisis. We're seeing it too, and it's happening in the services industries. People do not feel respected in teachers. So
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any thoughts you have about the existential crisis and how that fits into your idea of civic spirit, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to go on that. I think we see a lot of people dropping out, teachers, nurses, people like that, who are
Yep.
would require a different, in some ways, more Scandinavian ethos of the economy. As Canadians, we're always caught between America and Europe somehow. In some ways, it always seems like America's dragging us down a little bit in terms of the constructive social moves we could make. But the idea that you have to make the workplace, even for people who are doing serious work, like in hospitals or in schools, it has to be a place where there's mechanisms for their nervous system to calm down enough that they feel flexible enough to handle diversity and change, right? So it's not, like I say, it's not just diversity. There do need to be practices for unity with diversity, but essentially your system has to be capable of incorporation and adaptation, which means you can't be overloaded. I see a lot of that in like the way I think about the question of fascism, right? And it's traditionally defined as authoritarian nationalism, but if you put it in a developmental context, you can say, well, it's authoritarian nationalism where that's inappropriate to a modern system, right? Like the Germans were the height of modernity, and then they rolled back to ethnocentric theocratic feudalism. That's fascism, and it could happen at any level, right? The progressives notice fascism in the modernist tendencies and so on, right? And it seems like that rollback is a natural rollback where you can't trust
Yeah.
that the level you've achieved is working. So you roll back toward an
Yeah.
earlier level, but you only have a fantasy idea of the earlier level. It might not have been working anyway. The
Yeah.
alternative is the confidence that you can incorporate new things and you can solve the diversity not by cutting it away, but by integrating it to create a new unity. That's sort of a side question. I think the existential crisis element is a can be a huge part of the myth making needed to bring a population together. Right. There has to be a way, though, to unite those different, to the wilderness and the rural and the urban sensibilities on this. You
Yeah,
can't have a
they,
situation where you've got a prime minister who looks like he's an effete, well trained, well suited Franco Canadian is going to just impose some ecological regulations on oil workers in Alberta. That's not going to work. The optics are terrible on that. But you do have to aggressively start to overhaul the economy at a very rapid rate in favor of new ecological moves. But that has to be overtly about jobs. It has to come with a sense of robustness and sturdiness. You have to hear it from voices that you can relate to and not from a voice that seems very far away and from a social aspect of Canadian society that you don't trust and have nothing in common with. So I think we could build that. When I think about the way Christianity flourished as a kind of organizing paradigm, you've got your theologians in Rome and temperamentally, vibe wise, they have very little in common with the priest on the ground in northern Denmark. But they're both trying to orchestrate aspects of the same system. And I think a radical and accelerated ecological move to face an existential crisis could be done in a better, smarter, more stratified way, where there's
yeah,
different kinds of specialists in different cultural pockets speaking to it in different ways, but collaborating around general ideas of survival and thriving and facing this great common enemy together, of which everybody will have a different aspect of the existential crisis that they can personally relate to.
yeah, that's
Um,
nice.
and then the other part of it, I think, is it's the old it's hard to get a man to understand something if his paycheck depends upon him not understanding it, like basically Marxist critique in a way. Um, here's a complete fan. Here's a sci-fi fantasy scenario. In the sci-fi fantasy scenario, there's universal basic income, but it's a job. You can drop out of anything you're doing in society, and the government will guarantee the job. But the job is you have to mobilize to do something for the environment because we need massive cleanup. We need massive monitoring, right? So it's like a green French Foreign Legion. Any French citizen can drop out and join this project if they want to, and there's a guaranteed training and income that goes with it so that you would have an increase of social support, but an increase of individual responsibility and a future oriented project of some kind. I think the future element of it is really tricky because the future is where we're going to live. The future is where our thinking has to evolve. And I think in order to build civic spirit, you have to orchestrate it around unfolding a future together. But many people don't relate viscerally to the future. Most people, and when they live in community, they tend to relate to the past, right? So, on the one hand, it's obvious that the acknowledging and reconciling with the way that the state and the church has operated around indigenous communities and the training and harassment and trauma of indigenous children and their deaths over the years, that's something that has to circulate in the population. We have to deal with that emotionally, right? I've seen old men, right, very slowly come to awareness of the fact that that went on and that that's what their country's been doing. And so that kind of healing and reconciliation is huge, but it makes so much sense to us to look back to fix problems to get that spirit. We have to make it make sense to also look forward, maybe even more so than looking back, right? What's our constructive project and where's our confidence that we could maybe pull it off? What's our goal? I don't think there's been in Canada or hardly any other nation, maybe China has one, but an articulation of who we want to be in the world we expect to have exist 25 or 50 years from now.
Yep.
Right? Well, yeah, I think futurism is going to be a huge part of that, but the problem is how does the future seem visceral enough to people to make them care, to mobilize around it?
Yep. So Saving the Republic was this move by Brett Weinstein and a few others. Jordan Peterson got involved at some point, and some other big actors in the digital world. And you were saying I don't think it's going to go very far, and they didn't get very many people. It wasn't didn't go very far. But they had the idea that I thought was interesting, and that what fundamentally we want to open up the space so that people can feel free less fearful to appear in public spaces and in public institutions and be able to talk about what is valuable to them. Like if I want to talk about God and Jesus Christ, and if I want to talk about evolution, and the idea was to try and get out of the polarizing, so even someone as provocative as, Jordan Peterson, he still associated with that's a good thing. And he wants that in his university, George, the Peterson University just established. But of course, he has his limits on, who he'll invite to do courses there. But it was interesting, he had an evolutionary biologist, and then he had, Russell Brand, the born again Christian, they're up on the same stage. But I also noticed they were also behind plexiglass. And there is something just so paradoxical to the phenomenon. So I don't want to get into American stuff, but Jordan Peterson is Canadian. He's Canadian as can be. He's very Western Canadian and radicalized, in the conservative camp. But he certainly is attempting to move out there. So I think if we talk about existential crisis, I'm curious what he would say or respond to that. What do you think he might say? What's your take on Jordan Peterson and where he's a model for a lot of
Yeah.
Canadians in some ways.
Yeah. He's I don't know how much of his books you've read, but
No.
his personal story is that he was haunted by the possibility of nuclear apocalypse when he was younger, right? And he
Okay.
would have terrifying dreams, and so he
Okay.
was, according to him, he was very invested in left-leaning politics, and he was very
Huh.
driven by trying to understand why human beings would create this disastrous possibility, and that led him towards sort of Jungian ideas and things like that. So I think his migration has been to try to handle that anxiety by looking at it as a psychological and archetypal phenomenon. And that seems to be where he is right now. Like you can deal with that anxiety through psychology, and then you can get back to work in your local circumstance. And he's very, I mean, I think his thinking is evolving, but when it comes to making broader economic, political, and social and technological changes that might be needed to adapt to the current situation, he's very standoffish. I think I mean, that's a natural conservative tendency. We don't know what the outcome is, so let's not do anything. Um, I feel like he doesn't have a constructive proposal for dealing with the existential crisis per se, except at the level of individuals examining their emotions and psychology.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Wasn't aware, but yeah, it's an existential crisis, and I think a lot of his intensity that you feel from him with rage, anger, right at the below the surface, and yet he's got obviously an immense joy for life, immense passionate joy for life that I think is admirable. I hear he is sitting on an existential crisis that he knows exists. And I think his other strategy beyond that individual psychology, yes, personality and all those things, is orange meme. He's really driven to in the entrepreneurial sphere. The more I've listened to him and the more I see how, he's an Elon Musk lover, worshiper, basically. And Trump, for him, he said in an interview the other day, if I was Canadian, I would vote for Donald Trump. He says, I have to apologize for being a Canadian. He actually followed that statement. And I went, whoa, why would you add that? What? And so this is part of where today we're talking about the political sensibility of Canadians and Canada, in our very quick, short way here. But there's this like heightened the most well-known psychologist in Canada. Literally, I mean, there's no one who touches him as a psychologist giving advice to an entire nation and world. And he ends with, I would vote for Donald Trump. So, sorry, I have to apologize because I'm not Canadian. And then he sits back in his chair. And I just thought that gesture and that comment, what's behind that, do you think?
It's tricky because, I mean, there are questions of audience capture and salesmanship, and so he is speaking to his purchasing public to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I think there's a strong Western Canadian sense of resonance with the sort of wild aspect of American conservative values, where uh, an element of paranoid story making is combined with a deep impulse to be left alone by the
Yes.
state to
Yeah,
organize our own affairs
for
and
sure.
not be told that we have to adapt our values. Just let us run our own thing out here.
Yeah.
So I think he has a lot of that in himself. Um,
How about anti Justin Trudeau? In other words, I'm not a Canadian as long as Justin Trudeau is the leader of this country.
um, yeah, I mean, I think he always seems a little bit clumsy to me when he makes sociological or
Right.
political statements. That's not his area of expertise.
I agree.
But I think it's not out of the question to imagine he makes a run 5 or 10 years from now in Canadian politics. And I think one of the things he's doing is testing the waters by taking positions against existing political authorities.
Yeah. Well, if he doesn't run, the one thing he is doing is he's going out and interviewing. So he was out here in Vancouver recently and interviewed our conservative leader of the BC legislature, right? Mr. Rusted. And he's interviewing him on his big show, and earlier in the year, he interviewed Alberta's premier, um, and so he's a collector of a conservative movement, and he's building another world, and he's got his new ARC project. He's part of an ARC project, and you can just hear it, the rescue, whether it's Rescue the Republic or Rescue Humanity. So he's a real rescuer. And so one of the things in the dynamic of the difficulty of being in a political leadership of, let's just say, the best kind that you and I are possibly imagining today is what I call the problem of the rescuer. So how to be a leader in an existential crisis and all of the difficulties, and you really passionately have all those good feelings. I'm curious about you. Do you feel you have a rescuer in you, and what's happened to that over the years? Because it's the kind of classic, if there's a rescuer pattern dominating, it's going to always be looking for an oppressor, and it's going to always be looking for a victim. So this is the Virginia Satir triangulation in therapeutic systems.
I, I think if you dug enough, you could probably find something like that. But at the surface level, I don't relate too much to that pattern. I think the way I was treated as a child had such a high degree of autonomy that that's my default setting is like if someone's in a pit, they would ask me to help them out of a pit. I'm not going to try to get them out of a pit based on my assumption that they shouldn't be in a pit, right? So like there's a mutuality and a respect for the
Nice. Yeah.
existing integrity of the other that often I don't broach, and maybe sometimes I should broach it more. Um, but I don't have a strong rescuer impulse. I
Okay.
like to give the other a lot of space.
Yeah, I do too. Also curious about how is your level of compassion and where's it going?
It's tricky. I think it's very strong behaviorally in one-on-one scenarios, but when it comes to the level of describing large blocks of the system, I'm comfortable sounding compassionate or non-compassionate. I think they're like both are interesting ways to explore an issue, and it's a bit like, how much of the gas and how much of the brake are you going to use when you're driving the car? It's a constant adjustment because I think there are ways in which we uh, get over involved in other people's affairs. There's a lot of things that aren't really your business in a sense. Now, they
Okay.
could be, right? And everybody's suffering is, in a way, everybody's business.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
we
yeah.
exist in a media environment where it's economically incentivized to try to make you feel morally outraged and engaged in things that actually have nothing to do with you.
Okay.
Right. So there has to be some pushback against the feeling that we all have to feel engaged and compassionately activated all the time. And I think some of the conservative movements are a pushback against that. Like, can't
Yeah.
we just say fuck off to all of this for a while
Yeah.
and let ourselves rest in what we're already working on where we are?
And so you can see why that would breed a nationalism, a
Hmm.
retractive nationalism, and localism. and privatism.
Yeah.
I mean, you just watch those combinations. That makes sense. Like we are in a compassion fatigue world because of this multimedia, mass media. It's out compassioning us, it's like it demands more than we can serve. And that's a really
Mm.
helpless
Yeah.
feeling, right?
I think there's some other, like, I just thought of, I have a lot of trans friends, and my response is not, you're abnormal, or I feel deep compassion. My response is usually, why is this anybody else's business? And I'm really curious. I think for me, curiosity often takes the place that other people would fill in with compassion, which is, hey, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. I
Right.
don't have to be on a side. I don't have to lead with pity or lead with dismissal. I can lead with, well, just explain to me more about this. That sounds peculiar to me. I'd like to know more.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. I call that the learning paradigm when you really shift to a learning or meta learning paradigm, right? A metacognitive paradigm actually in your way of ontologically and epistemologically engaging the world. It's really what I'm hearing you say. I don't want to reduce it, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it really puts you in a place of if I'm not curious, right, about the other,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean you have to invade. It doesn't mean you have to protect or do something with what others are doing. But if I'm not caring, if I'm not curious caring, if
Mhm.
in that sense, some people say, well, you should worry about it. Well, I go, yeah, I'm not so sure about worried. But curious caring is one way to put it. And I call that a meta learning paradigm. That's a real shift, to be able to see not only you're a self-authoring person at that point, you've really built your autonomy, but it's you've got the caring element with the autonomy. And
Yeah.
I think that curiosity makes you the learner so you can be self-authoring while you're absorbing all of those inputs more or less. And I think the healthy part of what you're saying in the learning paradigm, I do it as well. I think I would burn out with compassionate burnout pretty quick. I'm a pretty sensitive individual.
Yeah, I definitely, that's a thing I struggle with, which is my entire life I've had to make sure not to over sympathize with all kinds of other experience because it can get really overwhelming.
Yeah.
One thing that came up for me as well is another aspect of curiosity for me is it's the beginning of what I think of as the opposite of the fascist move, which is the incorporative paradigm,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? If I think in a kind of shamanic way that there's energies of various kinds, in order to have a thriving system, you have to bring those energies on board and plug them into the system somewhere. And you can't do that if you're not interested in finding out more about them. When I was a kid, my the first thing that gave me a really positive feeling about Catholicism, and I think of this in some ways as the prototypical anti-fascist move, was they moved Jesus's birthday to basically the solstice because there was already a pagan celebration there. And you think, wow, the church changed Jesus's birthday in order to incorporate a pre-existing popular energy and make that energy part of themselves rather than an enemy they had to fight. I'm like, that's a really interesting move, and that's kind of a paradigm option for all of us going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Well, I have to go in a couple of minutes here. I have to teach this morning. I was just thinking I would share just for fun. Thank you. Wonderful conversation. I think you're just brilliant in the political thinking world. I want to hear more of you. I want to see you write more, publish whatever you do. I'll be glad to help you in any way to be a sidekick if you keep pursuing. You have so much that just flows out of you about how to work the political sphere. So appreciate all you've put in. And I want to just say my bit of Canadiana at my most earliest memory, and it goes back to when I was 21. And went to college and I moved up to Edmonton and I was going to start this, environmental degree, technical diploma at NAIT in Edmonton. But I wanted to play drums still because I had started when I was 14. I didn't want to lose my drummer musician. And so there was an ad in the paper and it was the Young Canadians. And the Young Canadians are these, totally opposite of the kind of kids that I grew up as, being a teenager with long hair and singing songs of revolution from the Beatles and Rolling Stones and Grateful Dead. And but I wanted to drum, so I actually went to the audition, and just to be with these young Canadians, totally fresh, totally naive, lots of beautiful girls. And so I ended up playing with them for about a year in their little band, and we'd go and do singing concerts. And they're singing these up from people. I think it was called Up for People. That was their theme song. And I remember having just a really heartfelt feeling. It was totally not my world, but I just want to celebrate that that was the most Canadian thing I ever did. And why I'm ending with it is I'm inviting, and as you know, in our last talk too, I said there's another way for young people to enter the political sphere. And I would really just I think that's what you and I are attempting, and others, to create a groove. We're not giving up and we're not falling into the old grooves only. So, Canadians, young people, up for people, whatever you want to call yourselves, um, just keep learning. And certainly, I think you and I would engage young people any moment. And we also need to think about how to reach out to them. That's something that's hard for us to do. And certainly it is when I'm 72 years old, and I just can't believe that they would want to know anything from me. Anything
Oh,
you have
that's great.
last to
Yeah.
say?
I love the prompt about what's your most Canadian moment ever, and I think my childhood Canada Day float thing is pretty good. I
Yeah,
thought of
pretty
two
good.
things though. One thing was I used to really listen to CBC radio because it was all we had where I grew up. And I would listen to it all Saturday, double exposure and basic black, and then, whatever, quirks and quarks and cross country checkup. And I was listening to the radio, and my parents came home from going to the post office in town, and they had the Canadian Encyclopedia in its 3 volumes, and I was wearing a red plaid shirt. So that was pretty peak Canada there. But the other one that came up for me was I lived in Osaka in Japan for a while, and I went to this party, and there were people, student teachers of English from all over, and there were a couple other Canadian guys there, and we had a Molson Canadian, and we talked about Kids in the Hall sketches, and none of the people from any of the other countries could understand. Well, when we tried to describe the sketches from the sketch comedy show, their faces would just go blank. They had no clue what we were talking about. It didn't make sense to them as comedy, and we all felt really bonded by the quirkiness and the peculiarity of what we had shared. So great prompt. Lovely to talk to you. Conversation we could definitely have more of, and I'm sure we will come up with another excuse to chat before too long. Thanks for doing this, Michael.
All the best.